Well, I didn't have much idea at all because I can remember in England I must have always been fond of parks and gardens, and I remember going to an old chap who was a nurseryman in a park and telling him quite excitedly that I was going to Australia, and this poor old man with a great big shovel beard, I can still see him, patted me on the head and said, "You poor dear child, fancy going out there amongst all those niggers."
I'm starting to remember my mother saying that after she'd been there a week or two, that if there'd been any way to get home, she'd have left straight away.
Group settlers from the southwest of Western Australia, or rather their children, recalling their migrant parents' first impressions of Australia in 1923. Bill Bunbury here with They Said You'd Own Your Own Farm, the story of group settlement in WA.
Well, we went up then, of course, and found our shack, and we got there with a mud floor, no doors, no windows, and our cup of tea was made of bracken water, which was shocking.
And my mother walked into the middle of sat on the luggage and looked around and said, "Dad, you don't mean to tell us we're going to live in here?" And Dad says, "Yes, love, this is where we're going to live." She said, "But Dad, they wouldn't keep a cow in a byre like this at home."
I was dressed in cream silk trousers, cream silk shirt. Mum sat me on a black sawn-off stump, and the next thing there was an unholy yell. I got a bull ant bite, but nobody knew what it was. And half the camp was out, wondering what had gone wrong.
George Brenton, who later became a successful dairy farmer in the same country his parents struggled with. For many of their generation, group settlement, as it was. For the background, historian Geoffrey Bolton.
It looked like a lovely coming together of two different needs. Britain was at war with Germany in the First World War, and Lloyd George and the other politicians of the time had promised the servicemen a land fit for heroes to live in. Western Australia felt itself to be in need of more people and more migrants and had plenty of land. And West Australian politicians such as Sir James Mitchell, Sir Hal Colbatch, saw the two as meshing together beautifully. Western Australia was at that time still an importer of dairy produce, and everyone thought this was scandalous for a place with such potential. And there was a common belief that because the southwest supported very tall timber, that it would also grow long grass and that the cattle will get fat. So anyway, after the war, the West Australian government stepped forward with great enthusiasm, offering itself as a place where the empire settlement schemes could take place. Western Australia seemed to look like the promised land.
I forget who it was. Oh, it was in a John Bull book. John Bull magazine. And we read it, and they said that within 5 years you would own your own farm. Well, naturally, we didn't expect to see miles and miles and miles of trees, did we?
Mitchell had been a very successful farmer in the Avon Valley, and he'd lived in the place all the time. He knew better than the experts. Admittedly, they didn't know about the role of trace elements, and they didn't know quite a number of other things that we know now. But even so, they should have realised that it was a fairly tough proposition on which to set inexperienced settlers from England who hadn't much first-hand knowledge of Australian conditions.
Well, there was hardly any of them farmers. Our next-door neighbour, he was a cabinet maker. And he told me one day, he said, the only time I've seen a cow is cut up in a butcher's shop. Well, he took a little while to get used to it. And then there was another settler. He came from Ireland, from Guinnesses, where they made the stout. He was a good stout maker. All the men said that. But fun-wise, they had such a lot to learn.
Some of them turned up in very bizarre clothing, I'm afraid. They still were going to their office, or thought they were anyway, and came in their gloves and hats and so forth, where others went reasonably dressed for work, and they were handed an axe and a mattock. And there had to be, I'm not quite sure of the acreage, but there had to be a certain acreage cleared on each block before there was any allotting of blocks done.
Now, not sufficient exploratory work had been done initially, and so the settlements were rushed in ahead of time. The men didn't have an opportunity of having the land properly surveyed, properly inspected in order to determine the difference between some blocks and others. And the result of that was that, so one of the supervisors told me that they sent a message to Sir James to say that they were unable to obtain the quantity of blocks properly surveyed which he needed to accommodate the numbers of people whom he wished to accommodate. And his reply was that if they couldn't find sufficient blocks quickly enough, he would soon find somebody who could.
The trouble was, I believe, that the timber was terribly heavy and the ferns, they were very thick. In man up the ferns, they didn't go. They often thickened when the land was cleared. And a paddock of grass, well, that would be taken over by the ferns, and it took too much work to get the ferns out, and it took too much work clearing up the paddocks. The small stuff was taken out. The big trees were ring-barked, and then the limbs would fall, and it was a year-by-year job. They'd pick up the limbs, they'd burn up the falling trees, and they'd cut their ferns. This took nearly all their spare time, and they didn't have time left to clear extra land as they would need to if they were going to get on.
Everybody was wanting to make something of themselves. They were going so quickly, you know. And farming isn't a quick thing, really. But it just, my hubby used to say, they're going mad, they're going too fast, you know.
You couldn't, on the swamps, you couldn't put a horse on. Everything had to be done by hand. We planted them by hand, dug them by hand, carted them off by hand.
When the blocks were balloted for, each family went onto their blocks. Well, in our family there were no sons, so the girls had to work. And my mother and I had to use a crosscut saw and cut down trees. And my father had a horse and a chain. He used to cut around great big sword grasses, if you know what a clump of sword grass is. He'd cut around the clump of sword grass with a spade. I'd have to hook the chain around it, and then he'd get the horse, and the horse would heave and heave and heave till he'd pull this sword grass over, and we'd go on and perhaps do a half a day doing that. And that's the place to see snakes, when you're tiger snakes at that, when you're in amongst thick, dense swordgrass country. And then there were big banksia trees which had to be sawed down, and they were sawed by hand with crosscut saws. And, well, today, no one would even dream of going to clearing in that way today. But that was all that was available in those days. Woman power, man power, and horse power, and children power.
I was about 14 and a half, I think, when we arrived at Tingledale. And boys of my own age and a little bit younger really enjoyed ourselves getting around through the bush. We used to cut poles with our little tommy hooks and jump over logs to see who could jump over the biggest logs and that sort of thing.
Then I can remember where the men used to ring bark the trees, and as the bark came off the trees, we used to make cubbies as the bark peeled off the big carry trees.
I think it was a marvellous childhood, because I loved the bush, and I loved horses, and I loved cows, and I used to love the milking and anything to do with a horse. I got more than one hiding for riding a horse that I wasn't supposed to and getting thrown off, but I had no fear of horses, so I used to do it with cart horse or anything, or even the wild brumbies that were out on the coast. I used to go out and catch them and bring them home, and then get into trouble when I got there from doing so.
Dances now, they were something. We used to go to what was the chap house for the group, you see. And we used to have mouth organs and an accordion, you know, and a rough old floor, of course. But they were the highlights of the week, you know, the dances and walking, and everyone taking the hurricane lamps and the red light when we got there. They were really something.
I happened to be the only one there that played what we call the old squeeze box. So, I'll just give you a few tunes now of the old days.
Talking of dances, I can always remember being a lad of 9 or 10, this chap that used to come to the dance in his horse and cart, and one night the boys played a trick on him. They took his horse out of the cart and pushed the shafts through the fence and put the horse on the other side, and that was always stuck in my memory as really funny. I probably wouldn't think so if it was played on me, but it was a real humorous event.
In them days, it was pretty tough, and the music was very scarce, so I used to go down to another place called Tingledale School, and give them a lift out there with the music. And one night, I got home, and I didn't like to make a noise because I hadn't milked my cows. So, I thought to myself, well, there's only one thing for it, and that's keep quiet and go home and go to bed. Otherwise, if the cows heard me, they'd start roaring and I couldn't get to sleep. So, we crawled up the paddock, went into bed, never said a word about it. And the cows never knew I was there.
10 threes are 30, 11 threes are 33, 12 threes are 36.
Every Friday, instead of having nature study in the school, we'd have nature study out in the bush. We'd take notebooks with us, and write it down. We'd go right through to Parry's and take our bathers with us, and he taught us all how to swim out in the channel out there. And also, as far as the wildflowers were concerned, we used to have a wheel that was made up every month as the wildflowers came out. We used to bring them to school, and we were allowed to draw on this wheel the month and the date as to when that flower came out, and we had a full 12 months record. As a matter of fact, I'd love to have that record now of all the wildflowers and orchids that we used to find. It gave us a lot of incentive to look for the flowers and the orchids, to be the first one to bring them along so we could draw them on this calendar wheel.
John Tonkin was one of the first teachers to serve on a group settlement. He recalls the value that parents placed on their children's education.
They would go without themselves in order to ensure that their children got education. And some of the children attending Group 6 and 7 had to ride horses to school, those who lived some distance. And I had one group of children who came some 6 or 7 miles to attend the school, and they were usually first there, actually.
Distances made a terrible lot. And really, in the old settlement, it was the women folk that couldn't take it, you know, lack of neighbours and that kind of thing. A lot of those that really left because of their women folk.
There was, I think 2 or 3 tragedies in that little area, and people would say, why does this happen? You know, in our little area, so much of it. There was often a sort of a hopelessness.
As against that, there are quite a few stories of cooperation, very generous cooperation among neighbours. The fact that if women with children were impoverished or distressed, that if people could, they tended on the whole to rally round. But as against that, you've got the tremendous environmental pressure. At one level, it was simply the fact that being surrounded by all those damn tall trees tended to dishearten people. At another level, they had been used to the amenities of gas and water and the fish and chip shop round the corner, and the privations of pioneering on even as simple a thing as having to cope with a Metters wood stove or something like that was often something fairly new.
I can remember my mother having to make bread with bran and being very upset because there was only bran and potatoes to feed the kids on, and upset because their tummies, the bran was too severe for their tummies, and that upset them. And I can remember my mother being very unhappy about that. Of course, there's lots of English things that I can remember upset my mother. One of the things that worried us the least but upset my mother the most was when our boots wore out. We landed with button boots and stockings and socks and all that sort of thing. And then when they wore out and my mother saw her children barefooted to an English woman, that was the big...
I can remember many times Mum going to bed crying because wouldn't know where the next meal was coming from. And I can remember as a young boy getting towed up the seat with Dad's toe, and we'd reckon he was a bad-tempered man, but thinking back now, I think a lot of it was brought about by anxiety and worry.
A lot of people walked off their farms when they thought they were on top, developed their 25 acres, and then their stock died on them. And it wasn't until about 1933 that the breakthrough came on cobalt that saved Denmark.
It seemed to us that the land on which we'd been settled was the cast-offs from the forestry department. We found mostly that our soil was very patchy, large areas of sand, sandy soil, very poor, black boys country and that sort of thing.
We couldn't get no dentist any nearer than Albany. So made arrangements with the dentist to come out, and we met him at our neighbour's place, and my wife sat down on a log in the bush till he pulled her teeth out, and from there we had to go back on a 4-mile track back to our home again. So in them days it was pretty hard, I think.
I was taken sick there. They put me in hospital for 3 weeks. I had typhoid fever, and Turner's lost a son. Then they brought in my son, and they both died, and they still didn't know what happened out there. Eventually, they found a cow dead in the stream where we got our water.
Well, the winters were terrible. The grass somehow didn't seem to grow well in the winters, and stock losses were abnormally high. Many cows died from fern poisoning, because of course there was so much ferns around. And many, I think it was just poverty, just the grass wouldn't shift in the winter.
We benefited from the fact of getting quite a few migrant families, and they did, many of them in the end, survive in one shape or form and contribute to the community.
Oh yes, we had a tough time there, all right. Oh, I suppose we were happy, we were young. You know, I mean, you've got your family, and that's all you want in those days.
A less ambitious scheme, better researched into better chosen areas, and perhaps without trying to tie it so greatly to the acclimatisation of unskilled migrants, might have got the same results with a whole lot less suffering.
I'd never go through it again or advise anybody to go through a hard time like that. It wants a lot more thought and consideration before they attempt these things. That was a failure to so many.
Well, we learned quite a lot about farming, possibly quite a lot about friendship.
It was the best. I wouldn't wish for better. It was an adventure for my parents, but always tinged with apprehension. I thoroughly enjoyed my life down there, the 6 years there, in which I reckon that I did more hard work than the average man does in the whole of his life. It was the best apprenticeship that I could have had.
That was They Said You'd Own Your Own Farm, the story of group settlement in Western Australia. You heard from Jack Brearley, Violet Onions, Peggy and Eileen Croxford, Beatrice and Edgar Whitfield, George Brenton, Jack Ricketts, Bill Harrison, Paddy Cochrane, Laura Mumford, Ellen Gale, Alf Tyndale, Florence Trudgeon, Jack Pascoe, Stan Ravenhill, John Tonkin and Geoffrey Bolton. I'm Bill Bunbury.